The year was 1942, and across America, the thunder of industry replaced the rhythm of everyday life. Cities that once echoed with the hum of car engines and streetcars were overtaken by the grinding roar of factories. Assembly lines that had been designed to produce consumer goods now carried the weight of the nation's survival. The air was filled with smoke and the sharp scent of oil and metal. Imagine walking into one of these factories where sparks leapt from welding torches and hammers rang against steel, a place where the urgency of war was etched into every sound. It was here that the Jeep, a small but mighty vehicle, began its journey to the front lines. The Jeep was not just another piece of equipment, it became the lifeline of soldiers who would soon depend on it in every corner of the globe. With the war spreading across continents, the United States faced an urgent demand for machines that could endure the mud of Europe, the deserts of Africa, and the jungles of the Pacific. The military called for something fast, rugged, and reliable. Meeting this demand required a transformation of industry on a scale never before attempted. To make 500,000 Jeeps in just a few years would test the strength of the nation's workforce like never before. But there was a problem. Millions of men who had once powered America's factories now wore uniforms and carried rifles. The workforce that remained at home was suddenly too small to shoulder the enormous burden of production. Yet the need could not wait. Tanks, planes, and ships were already being built in staggering numbers, and now the Jeep was added to the list of demands. The government turned to an unlikely source of strength, the women of America. Their entry into the factories was not only a necessity, it was a revelation that would shock the world. For many women, the factory floor was a foreign land. The clang of machines, the heat of furnaces, and the relentless pace of production replaced the quiet routines of home life. Gloves, goggles, and heavy boots became their new uniform. At first, there was hesitation, even fear, but the war did not allow time for uncertainty. Women learned to operate drills, welders, and presses with the same focus and discipline that soldiers applied to their rifles. Each step they took inside those factories was a step into history. The first Jeeps rolled off the lines with a sense of urgency that could almost be felt in the air. Their squat, practical design seemed unremarkable, yet their strength lay in their versatility. They could transport men, haul equipment, and climb landscapes that seemed impassable. Every bolt tightened by a woman in Detroit or Toledo meant one more vehicle ready for the brutal challenges of war. The connection between home and front line became a tangible reality, forged in steel and sweat. Imagine the scene, a long row of Jeeps gleaming under factory lights, their olive-drab paint still fresh, engines waiting for ignition. Outside, trains stood ready to carry them eastward, where ships would take them into battle. The workers, their hands sore and faces smudged with grease, watched the fruits of their labor roll past them. Many of these women had brothers, husbands, or sons overseas. They knew that the Jeeps they built could one day carry their loved ones through danger. Each vehicle became more than a machine. It was hope, strength, and survival on wheels. The transformation of American industry in those years was astonishing. But the deeper transformation was cultural. Women had crossed a threshold into work once thought impossible for them. They did not just fill the gaps left behind by men, they redefined what the workforce could be. In every clang of metal and roar of engines, a new chapter of history was being written. The war demanded speed and endurance, and the women of America delivered it with grit and precision. This was the beginning of a story that would ripple across the globe. The Jeep was not just built in America, it was built by America, with women at the center of its creation. Their presence on the factory lines would challenge perceptions at home and abroad. What began as a desperate solution to a wartime problem would become one of the most striking examples of how a nation's survival depended on the strength of its people. In the hands of these women, the Jeep became a weapon of resilience, ready to carry the fight to those who underestimated them. As the factories roared to life, and the first fleets of Jeeps rolled onto railcars bound for the coast, a sharp contrast began to emerge. On one side stood the reality of America's home front, where women filled the industrial void left by men who had gone to fight. On the other stood the perception of those who doubted them, most notably Adolf Hitler. In his speeches and private conversations, Hitler often dismissed the idea that women could shoulder the burden of heavy industry. To him, the thought of women building vehicles, welding steel, or managing assembly lines was laughable. He believed the moment American men left for war, the engines of industry would sputter and die. This belief was rooted in a worldview that saw women only as caretakers and homemakers. incapable of sustaining an industrial war machine. Hitler envisioned America crippled by its reliance on what he considered a weaker workforce. The irony was that while he clung to this conviction, thousands of women in Detroit, Toledo, and countless other cities were already mastering machines that few men had ever touched. They were riveting, grinding, welding, and assembling with growing confidence. Every completed Jeep became a quiet but resounding rebuttal to his disdain. At home, skepticism was also present, though it was tempered by necessity. Many Americans initially questioned whether women could handle the grueling pace of factory life. Supervisors worried about productivity, mistakes, and discipline. Some feared that the introduction of so many inexperienced workers would slow production rather than speed it up. But as weeks turned into months, those doubts began to vanish. Women proved themselves capable, not only meeting quotas, but in many cases exceeding them. The sheer scale of Jeep production would soon make disbelief impossible. Picture a scene in 1943. Rows of women bent over workbenches, their hair tied back with scarves to keep it clear of the machines, the floor beneath them vibrating with the steady hum of engines. Sparks showered from welding arcs, and the smell of hot steel filled the air. The supervisors who had once frowned in doubt now hurried to keep up with the pace of production. The women, many of them mothers and daughters, took pride in every Jeep that left the line. Far from being a weakness, they had become the backbone of American industry. Abroad, Hitler's disbelief began to collapse under the evidence of Allied success. As Jeeps appeared in convoy after convoy, their numbers overwhelming in both Europe and the Pacific, the assumption that women could not produce on such a scale was exposed as false. Each vehicle that reached the front was not just a piece of equipment, it was a challenge to his ideology. The same women he had dismissed were building the very machines that carried soldiers forward, often against his own armies. What was meant to be America's downfall had turned into its strength. The conflict between expectation and reality gave the Jeep a symbolic weight beyond its practical value. It was not only a tool of war, it was a rolling testament to determination, skill, and resilience. Every bolt tightened, every gear assembled, was a reminder that underestimating women had been a grave mistake. The more Jeeps that arrived overseas, the more obvious the contrast became. America was not weakened by sending men to fight. It had been strengthened by the women who stepped forward to take their place. In this difference between perception and reality lay the shock that would echo through history. Hitler's scorn gave way to the undeniable truth of 500,000 Jeeps, each one a product of hands he had deemed unworthy. For the women who built them, every mile those vehicles travelled was proof of their triumph over doubt and dismissal. The clash of ideas between belief and fact, arrogance and effort, was playing out not only on battlefields, but also on the factory floors of America. Long before the Jeep became a symbol of resilience, it began as a simple solution to a desperate problem. In the early years of the Second World War, the US Army realized it needed a lightweight, all-terrain vehicle capable of replacing the motorcycle and sidecar units of the past. Soldiers required something that could carry men, weapons, and supplies across mud, sand, and uneven ground without breaking down. The answer came in the compact design of the Jeep, a vehicle that looked plain but could endure punishing conditions. Once approved, it became clear that tens of thousands would not be enough. The Army demanded hundreds of thousands, and they wanted them fast. Meeting that demand would require a workforce larger than anything the auto industry had ever known. As men poured into the military, the country faced a massive shortage of industrial labor. Entire shifts of skilled workers vanished overnight as they traded factory uniforms for combat gear. Factories that had once depended on male expertise were suddenly left vulnerable. The government and industry leaders turned to the only available resource that remained: women. At first, the idea seemed experimental, even risky. Yet with every passing day, the urgency of war gave them little choice. If America was to meet its military needs, women would have to build the tools of victory. For many women, stepping into a factory was like entering another world. The massive clang of machinery drowned out conversation, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of hot steel and the smell of oil. Training sessions were brief, and errors could mean injury or wasted material, but there was no time for hesitation. They learned quickly, mastering the use of heavy drills, welding torches, and mechanical presses. Gloves became blistered, and faces were streaked with sweat and grime. But skill and confidence grew with every passing week. Soon, women were not just filling gaps in production. They were driving the entire process forward. Imagine a young woman from Ohio, perhaps only 19, standing at a workbench for the first time. Her hands tremble slightly as she adjusts the controls of a drill press. A supervisor watches closely, doubtful of her precision. The machine roars to life, vibrating under her grip, and the sharp scent of burning metal fills the air. She steadies herself, completes the task, and sets aside the finished piece. Around her, dozens of others are doing the same. In that moment, she is no longer simply someone filling in for absent men. She has become a builder of war. And with every part she finishes, the Jeep comes closer to life. The Jeep itself was deceptively simple, which made it ideal for mass production. Its design was rugged, with flat panels and minimal curves, allowing pieces to be stamped and assembled quickly. Yet behind this simplicity lay incredible versatility. The vehicle could climb steep slopes, ford shallow rivers, and endure the harshest terrain without faltering. Soldiers would later call it one of the most indispensable tools of the war. But on the assembly lines, its creation was a test of endurance for those who built it. Every component, from the frame to the smallest bolt, carried the weight of urgency. Women soon discovered that factory work required not only strength, but also patience and precision. The pace was grueling, often stretching from dawn until nightfall, with little rest in between. Mistakes were costly, but determination kept them moving. For many, the Jeep became more than just another product on the line. It was a symbol of contribution, a machine that might one day carry their loved ones across a battlefield. Each vehicle that left the factory stood as proof of their sacrifice and resolve. What began as necessity grew into a profound cultural shift. Women had been called into the factories to keep the machines running, but their success revealed a deeper truth. They were not just substitutes, they were innovators, workers, and patriots in their own right. In mastering the creation of the Jeep, they had reshaped the very fabric of the workforce. This was the origin story of a vehicle that would come to embody Allied strength and of a movement that would forever change the role of women in American society. By the time the Jeeps reached the front lines, their presence was nothing short of transformative. On the battlefields of North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific, soldiers discovered that this small, box-shaped vehicle could do the work of many machines. It darted across muddy roads, climbed steep hillsides, and navigated jungles where larger trucks would bog down. In convoy, a line of Jeeps resembled an unstoppable stream of green steel, carrying men and equipment to places that might otherwise have been unreachable. For the troops who relied on them, the Jeep was more than a vehicle. It was a trusted companion, always ready to move at a moment's notice. The impact was immediate. Jeeps became the backbone of mobility for American and Allied forces. They carried messages when radios failed, brought ammunition forward under fire, and hauled the wounded back to safety. Soldiers often spoke of the Jeep as if it were alive, giving it nicknames and treating it with a kind of reverence. Imagine being a young soldier in Italy, weary from days of fighting, and suddenly hearing the hum of a Jeep engine approaching through the darkness. Relief swept through the unit because it meant supplies, reinforcements, or evacuation was on the way. The vehicle itself became a symbol of survival. Every Jeep that rolled into combat carried with it the unseen presence of those who had built it back home. Men driving through the mud of Normandy or the sands of Tunisia were supported by women who had welded its frame and tightened its bolts. This connection between factory and battlefield was profound. Soldiers often said they felt the strength of home carried with them when they rode in a Jeep. Though the women who built them never saw the front lines, their work reached into foxholes, command posts, and casualty stations across the globe. The Jeep was their contribution, rolling through fire and smoke. The versatility of the Jeep made it invaluable in ways no one had fully predicted. Generals used them as mobile command posts, where maps were spread across hoods and strategies drawn in pencil while engines idled. Medics turned them into makeshift ambulances, strapping stretchers across the back to carry the wounded. Infantry squads relied on them to carry heavy machine guns and mortars, giving them greater firepower in sudden skirmishes. The Jeep did everything asked of it, and more. Wherever it went, it left a trail of reliability and endurance, much like the hands that built it. The sight of Jeeps in endless convoys became a psychological weapon as much as a logistical one. To the Allies, it inspired confidence, proof that the supply lines were strong and unbroken. To the Axis, it was a reminder of America's relentless industrial power. No matter how many were destroyed, more arrived to replace them. Imagine watching from a hillside as hundreds of jeeps rolled across the countryside, engines buzzing, dust rising in thick clouds. The impression was not only of mobility, but of inevitability. The enemy could see that America's supply machine was tireless. For the soldiers who rode in them, the jeep was often the first and last touch of home they experienced. It carried them to the front, into the heart of battle, and sometimes back to safety. Its engine was a steady heartbeat amid the chaos of war. Many remembered the vehicles long after the fighting ended, recalling the smell of gasoline, the rough seats, and the way the small machine seemed indestructible. The jeep became part of the memory of the war itself, inseparable from the stories of bravery and survival told by those who had been there. On the battlefield, the jeep proved the value of the work done by women thousands of miles away. It was the physical link between their determination at home and the victory unfolding abroad. Soldiers often spoke with awe about the sheer number of jeeps that appeared wherever they were needed. To them, it seemed as though America's factories were never-ending rivers of steel. And in truth, that was not far from reality. The jeep became one of the most powerful symbols of how ordinary hands on the home front could shape the course of war across oceans and continents. The story of the jeep was more than a tale of mechanics and production. It was a story of power and perception. Every jeep that rolled off the line told the world something about America's ability to adapt and endure. Adolf Hitler had assumed that with men gone to war, American factories would falter. He believed the nation would crumble under the weight of its own demands. But as convoys of jeeps streamed into battle, the truth became undeniable. Women had not only held the line of production, they had pushed it forward with astonishing success. This industrial triumph carried enormous psychological weight. For the Allies, it became a symbol of reassurance, proof that America's resources were vast and its resolve unshakable. For the Axis, it was a source of frustration and dread. Every jeep seen on the battlefield meant that despite bombings, blockades, and predictions of failure, America's factories were working at full strength. The women who tightened bolts and welded frames had contributed to a force that was as devastating as any weapon. Their work spoke louder than propaganda, undermining Hitler's confidence and boosting Allied morale. Back home, the consequences were equally profound. The entry of women into factories challenged traditions that had stood for generations. Once, a woman's place was thought to be only in the home, managing family and household. Now, she stood at the heart of the nation's industrial machine, building vehicles that determined the outcome of global battles. Neighbors, communities, and even skeptical supervisors began to see women differently. They were no longer only wives, sisters, and mothers. They were welders, machinists, and builders of war. The change was cultural as much as it was industrial. The social impact did not pass unnoticed by the women themselves. Many found a new sense of purpose and pride in their work. They knew the jeep they built might carry a soldier to safety or deliver crucial supplies under fire. Each vehicle was not an abstract product, but a tangible contribution to the fight. The war gave them opportunities and responsibilities that had once been closed off, and in seizing them, they proved their value beyond question. Their success was a revelation to a nation that had underestimated them for too long. Imagine a group of women leaving a factory after a long shift, their clothes streaked with grease, their arms sore from hours of labor. They walked past the rows of jeeps ready to be shipped overseas, knowing that their effort would soon cross oceans and change battles. For some, their husbands or sons might ride in those very vehicles. The pride they felt was mingled with worry, but also with the knowledge that they were no longer bystanders to history. They were participants, shaping it with their own hands. In that moment, the meaning of citizenship had changed. The broader implications of this shift extended far beyond the war years. The success of women in factories raised questions about the future of work and equality. If women could build 500,000 jeeps in the face of global conflict, what else could they do in times of peace? The war had opened a door that could not be entirely closed again. Even as the conflict raged on, people began to recognize that the contributions of women were not temporary acts of necessity, but proof of untapped strength. The jeep was both a vehicle of war and a vehicle of social change. Thus, the wider consequences of the jeep's story were felt on two fronts. On the battlefield, it gave the Allies a decisive edge, delivering mobility and reliability wherever they were needed. At home, it reshaped how women were viewed and how they viewed themselves. The vehicle became more than steel and rubber. It was a symbol of transformation. Hitler's scorn had turned into America's triumph, and the women who built the jeep had altered the course of both war and society. Their impact reached further than they could have ever imagined, ensuring that the legacy of their work would echo long after the guns fell silent. By 1944, the scale of production had reached a staggering peak. Factory floors thundered day and night as women pushed assembly lines to their limits, determined to meet the demands of the war. The result was a torrent of jeeps, each one stamped with the sweat and determination of countless workers. More than 500,000 rolled out of American plants, a number so vast that it seemed almost impossible to grasp. They became as common on the battlefield as rifles or helmets, a constant reminder of the nation's industrial might. For Adolf Hitler, who had once mocked the idea of women driving war production, the sight of endless columns of jeeps was a bitter shock. The moment of truth came when these vehicles began flooding into combat zones faster than they could be destroyed. For every jeep lost to mud, mines, or enemy fire, another seemed to appear, fresh from the factory. Soldiers joked that jeeps multiplied overnight, but the truth was far more powerful. They were the products of a workforce that refused to falter despite exhaustion and sacrifice. Imagine the disbelief of enemy troops watching convoy after convoy roll past, each vehicle carrying soldiers, ammunition, or supplies. It was a display of relentless endurance that no propaganda could deny. For the women in the factories, the climax of production was not measured in statistics, but in the sight of their work filling the headlines and photographs of the war. Newspapers showed jeeps carrying generals, rescuing wounded men, and racing across the front lines. Each image was proof that their labor reached beyond the walls of their workplaces. Many wrote letters to family overseas, asking if they had seen or ridden in jeeps. The possibility that their own brother, husband, or son had touched the machine they built gave their work an emotional weight, unlike any job they had ever known. Every gear they tightened was a thread connecting them to the very heart of the war. The climax also carried with it an undeniable sense of vindication. Hitler's scorn had painted women as incapable, but now their achievement was written across battlefields worldwide. Factories led by women had outproduced expectations, delivering results that silenced doubters. The magnitude of jeep production became a symbol of how ideology could crumble against reality. Where arrogance saw weakness, determination created strength. The women who welded frames and checked engines had not only proven their own value, but had also turned enemy assumptions into folly. In military strategy, numbers often dictate outcomes, and in this regard, the jeep became a decisive weapon. Its sheer abundance overwhelmed logistical challenges and gave Allied forces unmatched mobility. A general in Europe could plan an advance knowing that jeeps would carry his orders, supplies, and men forward without delay. A medic in the Pacific could count on jeeps to pull wounded soldiers from the line of fire. Behind each of those moments was the immense effort of workers who never saw the battlefield, yet whose contribution shaped its very outcome. The climax of jeep production was not only industrial, it was deeply human. Imagine standing at the edge of a factory lot in 1944, watching as row upon row of jeeps stretched into the distance, their olive-drab paint gleaming under the sun. Workers stood silently for a moment, taking in the sight of their achievement. The hum of engines starting up filled the air, a chorus of mechanical voices ready for war. Trains pulled in, loading the vehicles bound for ports where ships would carry them across oceans. For the women who built them, that sight was the pinnacle of their wartime effort, a visible, undeniable triumph. It was proof that they had risen to the greatest challenge of their lives. The climax of this story was more than a number on a production sheet. It was the moment when doubt turned into recognition, when the world could no longer deny the power of women's labor. Hitler's disbelief had been shattered, and in its place stood 500,000 jeeps, each one a testament to perseverance. The climax was not only a victory for America's military, but a victory for the workers who had defied expectation. From that point on, the jeep was not simply a tool of war, it was the embodiment of a nation's resolve, and of the women whose hands had carried it into existence. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the roar of factories slowly quieted as well. Production lines that had once poured out endless jeeps returned to making cars, appliances, and peacetime goods. Many women who had worked day and night with oil-stained hands and blistered palms were told it was time to return home, to resume the roles they had left behind. Yet the memory of their contribution could not be erased. They had built more than machines. They had built a bridge between home and battlefield, a bridge that carried the weight of victory. For the soldiers who fought overseas, the jeep remained etched into memory. They recalled the smell of gasoline and rubber, the rough feel of its seats, and the way its engine seemed unstoppable even in the harshest conditions. More importantly, they remembered what it represented. Each Jeep carried not only soldiers and supplies, but also the unseen presence of the women who had forged it. In the mud of France, the sands of Africa, and the jungles of the Pacific, these vehicles became proof of a united home front. They symbolized a nation's determination, flowing across the world in steel and wheels. The legacy of the women who built them extended far beyond the war. Though many were urged to return to domestic life, they carried with them the pride and confidence of what they had accomplished. They had proven to themselves and to the world that they were capable of sustaining an industrial machine as vast and powerful as America's. The war may have ended, but the precedent was set. The memory of their labor lingered in the national consciousness, reshaping conversations about work, equality, and opportunity for decades to come. The Jeep became not only a war icon, but also a symbol of a turning point in social history. Imagine one of those women years later, walking with her grandchildren and passing by a military museum. She stops before a Jeep on display, its olive paint faded with time, its frame still solid. To others, it is a relic of war, but to her, it is something more personal. She remembers the long nights, the deafening machines, and the pride she felt as she watched fleets of Jeeps leave the factory. She tells her grandchildren that she helped build vehicles like this, and in their wide eyes, she sees the reflection of her legacy. That moment captures the essence of what was left behind, not only machines, but stories of courage and determination. The Jeep's story became part of the broader narrative of American strength during the Second World War. It was remembered as the workhorse of the Allies, but also as the product of hands that history had often overlooked. Women, dismissed by enemy leaders and doubted by their own country, had risen to meet the greatest challenge of the century. Their success did not just shock Hitler. It reshaped the very idea of what a nation could achieve when all of its people were called upon to act. The Jeep was their creation, but its endurance was their message. In the end, the legacy of the Jeep builders was both practical and symbolic. They had built over 500,000 vehicles that gave the Allies unmatched mobility, saving countless lives and shaping countless battles. Yet they had also built a new understanding of what women could accomplish when given the chance. The factories had closed, the war had ended, but their achievement lived on. It lived in the steel frames of Jeeps that survived the war, in the photographs of convoys that stretched across continents, and in the stories passed down through generations. The legacy of these women ensured that their labor was not forgotten, but honored as one of the great triumphs of the war. Thus the story closes where it began, with a small, rugged vehicle that carried more than men and supplies. It carried the weight of a nation's determination, the strength of its people, and the defiance of women who refused to be underestimated. The Jeep became a weapon of war, but also a symbol of transformation. In its wheels and gears lay the proof that ordinary citizens could rise to extraordinary challenges. And in its story, the world was reminded that victory was forged not only on the battlefield, but also in the tireless hands of those who built the tools of freedom.